And now we will actually go into the most exciting part of the day, because this is about UN reforms. Are there any progress, or it is deadlock? And as we look back, of course, we have been talking reform program for the UN for many years, from the Brahimi report, and then Ban Ki-moon started something that led into a HIP report. It led into an implementation plan, something he decided not to touch until the next SG. And something is going on, but where are we exactly now, and are there any progress? That is what we want to find out with the help of three outstanding persons who know all about it. First, it's Sam Daws, who is the director on a project on UN governance and reform, Oxford University. He's also able to write, in the sense that he has been edited and authored the book, the Oxford Handbook on the United Nations in 2018, and he had even done 8 volumes on the United Nations from 2000 to 2015. So that is Sam. And then the name I have tried to, together with her, to exercise the pronunciation, Raimonda Murmokaite. Was it close? Okay. She has a background as a former representative and permanent representative to the UN Security Council and from Lithuania. She's now back in Lithuania working in the Security Policy Department as director. And she's been working a lot on the UN in terms of also accountability, protection of civilians and the rules of law. And we also look forward to hear you and your views. And then from Germany, Sebastian von Einsiedel, who is working with the Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich. He's also the Vice-Rector in Europe for the United Nations University. And we also look forward to hear your opinion on the topic. You have each 12 minutes, and I'll sit next to you so that I can give you a small sign when the 12 minutes has passed. Sam, you have the word.
Thank you very much, Kurt. I'm delighted to be here. I should add to that introduction, kind introduction. I'm more of a practitioner than an academic, having worked in and around the UN for just over 30 years now. So I hope that I will be able to offer some thoughts from that perspective rather than an academic one. In my 12 minutes, I'm going to seek to make 8 succinct points. The first is the goals of the Secretary General's reforms are to prioritize prevention and better sustain peace. And against that lofty ambition, the restructuring of the 2 new departments, DPO and DPPA, and the new reporting relationship, the UN for UN resident coordinators, appears very modest, albeit achieved against such a challenging backdrop for multilateralism. But the reforms so far, I think, mask a greater potential prize, and that's the creation of a new UN management culture and a better alignment of the UN's peace and security pillar with its development and human rights work. But these are far from easy to achieve. So the challenges to achieving this include mismatched incentives and timeframes and the issue of finance. In the early 2000s, I had the opportunity to serve as a first officer to UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. And every morning when I emerged out of the elevator on the 38th floor, the geography of the executive office of the SG was palpable. You turned left towards the Secretary General, and there was the hive of activity around a 24-hour news cycle around conflicts. You turned right towards the office of the Deputy Secretary General, and the change in pace was clear. People working just as hard, but they were working around much longer-term incentives for progress on development. It was then and now very difficult to marry these 2 different incentive cultures to genuinely sustain peace. And secondly, where will the funding for sustaining peace come from? There were hopes of the World Bank bringing its resources muscle to post-conflict peace building along the lines of the Partnership for Peace initiative. But will the bank's focus on prevention and on vulnerable countries outlast Kim's imminent departure? And the real money, of course, lies outside of multilateral organizations altogether. We know that official development assistance is already dwarfed by FDI, remittances, and foreign direct and developing country taxes, and that's likely to increase. But can we unlock the obstacles to, for example, sovereign wealth funds or pension funds investing at scale in low-carbon, pro-poor projects in the developing world, when the obstacles to investing in conflict-affected countries are so myriad? Secondly, the Secretary-General has made tangible progress, and this is where I think you can really see some difference, in gender equality in senior peace and security appointments. This in turn owes much to the leadership of countries such as Denmark, creating a pipeline of qualified senior women through their national action plans for the implementation of 1325. And this pipeline means that we now have senior women assuming USG, SRSG and force commander roles. But the UN still has a long way to go, as evidenced by peacekeeping misconduct and the results of yesterday's Deloitte survey on sexual harassment at the UN. Third, the SG's attempt to break down the UN silos is, I think, helped by the design of the SDGs, and not just the reference to peaceful societies in SDG 16. The SDGs, much more than the MDGs, focus on the means as well as the ends, the need to create accountable and inclusive institutions, essential to tackling corruption and attracting private capital. Their focus on jobs, on energy, on infrastructure is the backbone to sustain prosperity. And while human rights have recently been losing out, in Guterres' words, to the state sovereignty agenda, the SDGs are imbued with human rights through a set of indicators and targets based on leaving no one behind. Indeed, Denmark has a key opportunity to create synergies between human rights and sustaining peace as a current member of the UN Human Rights Council and a significant UN troop contributor. And as Bertie has done, I would direct you to the perceptive doctoral thesis of our conference organizer, Troels Engel, and I think he really grasps the difficult challenge of how do you operationalize the human rights security nexus. Fourth, poverty and conflict are converging. The poor are increasingly concentrated in fragile states. At over 50% today, this concentration is projected to reach 80% by 2025. The 19th century British parliamentarian William Cobbett famously said, "I defy you to agitate a man with a full stomach." And today, we appreciate that the link between poverty and conflict is more complex than that. Endemic poverty is not in itself the main precursor to armed conflict. Instead, it's as much the perception of relative deprivation, and that has significant implications for UN designs to sustain peace. Fifth, from Brahimi to Hippo, we know that improved peacekeeping rests on an agreed political strategy supported by commensurate resources. But we're seeing increased member state divisions over such strategy. We have downward budgetary pressures when the most expensive missions, CAR, DRC, Mali, South Sudan and Somalia, are also those where there's scant peace to keep. So a low-cost transition to a post-conflict peace-building phase remains elusive. And it was commonplace until recently to say that divisions among the P5 on the Ukraine and the Middle East didn't contaminate the rest of the Council's agenda. 90% of resolutions were still passed by consensus and so on. But recent votes on the CAR and elsewhere bring that into question. Sixth, the main obstacle to UN Security Council reform remains first and foremost the high amendment requirement of the UN Charter. You need a two-thirds vote in the General Assembly, and then you need two-thirds of the world's parliaments to ratify, including, at that stage, the P5. So in the absence of constitutional reform, what can we do? Well, the GA has been asserting its subsidiary role under the UN Charter, under the kind of Uniting for Peace resolution, by passing almost identical resolutions that were being vetoed in the Security Council on Syria and Ukraine. We've seen continued attempts to improve transparency and accountability through ACT and enhanced TCC and friends groups. We've seen greater also developing country ownership of peace and security agenda, from Brazil's responsibility whilst protecting norm to the expansion of AU operations and doctrine, and to enhance Chinese strategic interest in a peaceful Africa, from the building of the new AU headquarters to the fact that there are now more Chinese peacekeepers than the other 4 permanent members combined. 7th, Antonio Guterres is the first SG with a science and technology background. We know, it's kind of a known unknown in Rumsfeld terms, that the next 2 decades will bring dramatic breakthroughs in science, technology, engineering, and medicine. So how can the UN reform agenda reform from a relatively slow-moving, hierarchical, state-based organization to harness these discoveries? Well, the SG's new tech strategy, his new panel on digital cooperation, are signs that he really gets this. And in particular, I think there's huge potential for big data, AI, and mapping to transform the identification of incipient conflict and enable rapid response. And then finally, the challenge for the UN reform agenda of responding to new and emerging threats. We've heard mention of transnational terrorism and organized crime, unattributed or unattributable cyber attacks, antimicrobial resistance, and pandemics. Most of all, our changing climate will have potentially dramatic consequences for energy, water, and food security, and on migration patterns. Ellen Loy questioned if there was anything the Security Council can legitimately say on climate change, and indeed Germany is grappling with how best to use its current non-permanent seat on the Security Council to do this. I agree with Loy that the UN Security Council should not prescribe on climate policy, but it surely retains a responsibility under the Charter to alert the international community to major threats to international peace and security. And climate may be humanity's greatest security challenge, and in Jan Eliasson's words today, an existential threat to us all. And I hope, therefore, that the Security Council will speak with credibility to national security constituencies to help ensure that the allocation of resources in national budgeting is commensurate with the threat that climate change presents. Thank you very much.
And next speaker, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, Kurt. And I have to start saying I have tremendous respect for the SRSGs, the jargon of the United Nations, the heads of missions, 3 of them in various categories as force commanders, as heads of missions are here. And certainly I'll start with something related to what they do. Excuse my rambling, it will not be a coherent statement. And a disclaimer, everything's very personal. It's private personal views stemming from the experience I had. And the first experience is the head of a complex peacekeeping mission in a highly volatile situation, joining an urgent council meeting by VTC at 3 a.m. in the morning, his time. On New York side, 15 countries, member states reading their prepared statements, barely any questions asked, well into 5 o'clock in the morning for the head of the mission. And then he just gets up and goes and does the work that he's supposed to do on the ground with little sleep, if at all, and with no practical advice or suggestions from the Security Council side. Peacekeepers, and that links to the first session of today, peacekeepers trading their food rations with other troops in order to be able to buy necessary medicines because they haven't been paid salaries for months. I've met situations for 6 months, for a year, in certain situations. Ill-prepared, ill-equipped, ill-trained, ill-treated. Some peacekeepers were losing their lives to protect civilians in conflict zones, while other peacekeepers were sexually exploiting the victims. Up to 200 peacekeepers in one particular mission sick with malaria at any given time, impacting the ability of the mission to operate. And the issue never came up at the briefings or consultations of the Security Council until we found out during a field trip and started asking questions. And then, as if a dam were broken, information started pouring in about how bad the situation was and what problems that particular operation was facing. But what prevented DPKO to ask and to provide that information before? That's beyond me. Peacekeepers uncertain if they'd have enough fuel to carry out the next area patrol or to return a UN plane back from a protection camp mission to the headquarters. On a specific occasion, 3 counterterrorism-related visits to one country in the Sahel region, each within 2 weeks, with countless questions and meetings and interviews, and the local staff complaining that they don't have time to do their job because they have to answer all these questionnaires and meet with the CT officials, while the recommendations take time for over a year to be prepared, and these recommendations could have been written just by Googling information on the internet. Council briefings and open debates, a recital of prepared statements, whether it's the 12th or 15th speaker, they would just go through every single fact and every single point as if he's the first and the only person to speak in that situation. Increasingly repetitive open debates with 70, 90, up to 100 speakers, time-consuming, and adding little, if anything, to the normative development of the issues at hand. Heads of states speaking to a semi-empty room at the Security Council, because after the 15 Security Council members have spoken, most leave the room, and we have interns taking notes. Why am I saying this? Besides everything else, is just the increase of the workload from 69 meetings in 1999 to 290 meetings in 2017, 2018. Even the largest delegations were complaining about the workload. The Chinese, the Russians, the Americans. Imagine small and non-permanent members sitting there and doing the job and trying to keep up with the whole range. So why am I talking about all of this? I don't know. It's just a question of the reform and what reform means to all of us, I think. Because there's the formal part of it, the reform that has been going on from 1993 under various titles, and that reform runs down basically to 5 groups of questions: geographical representation, use of veto, working methods, number of seats, and types of membership. 2 major groups, G4 and African countries, saying we have to expand both permanent and non-permanent seats, and then United for Consensus, which is saying non-permanent seats only. Given how entrenched these positions are, agreement is very hard to reach, and certainly even if the agreement were reached, you need 2/3 General Assembly members voting for the reform. Then you need 2/3 of world's parliaments to endorse that reform, to ratify it, and all 5 permanent members to say yes. What the likelihood of a reform is in that sense, I leave it to you. But does that mean that the reform is dead on arrival? I don't think so, because the reform has been happening independently, and that's at least the way I perceive the situation, very incrementally, very slowly, but it's been happening in the work of the Security Council. And as dramatic, as absurd these situations are, and there are lots more of such situations that we could refer to, where force commanders are rarely invited to meetings with the SRSGs, although I would assume they should work as a team, and when force commanders are invited to briefings, at least in my experience, they barely have time. They read their statements, we read our statements, but when a question time comes, the session has run out. At the same time, I think, and largely to non-permanent members, although some of the permanent members have been helpful in that respect as well, change has been happening. More open debates, more public briefings, more consultations with the involvement of civil society, NGOs, steps to improve slowly relations with the troop-contributing countries, regional actors such as the African Union. Over the last few years, considerable improvements in the work of subsidiary bodies, sanctions committees, counterterrorism and Al-Qaeda committees. A lot of that has recently been codified and issued as collection of best practices. And at least our delegation is very proud and happy to have contributed to these changes in terms of how subsidiary bodies work. Most of these improvements came up, at least from our side, rather randomly. Sometimes because we didn't know much. We were asking simple questions. Why are things done in a certain way? Why aren't they done in a certain other way, which would make sense? It turns out nobody's ever asked questions. And a lot of what we managed to push through, very basic things when you think of it, how the council works and how the sanctions committees work. I mean, if we deal with the sanctions on a certain country, on members' bodies in a certain country, why don't we talk to neighbors of that country? Why don't we see what kind of capacity building they require? Why don't we talk with the regional organizations which are involved in a certain country? Turns out nobody's tried and nobody's bothered to do that before. It was surprising how much could have been done just, as I said again, by asking questions. And asking questions as a whole, it's not a reform, it's not a big thing, but I think it's a huge thing if you want to change the way an organization works. Because if we don't ask questions, if we don't do impact assessment, how can we know that we're on the right track? If we're pursuing certain policies, if we're creating all these Christmas tree mandates for peacekeeping operations, if we issue recommendations on how counterterrorism strategies should be pursued in individual countries, and we never look back, we never measure, we never check whether what we've recommended, what we've insisted on, has a real impact on the ground, whether it works. Maybe it works in the opposite direction than we expected. If we don't do that impact assessment, then I think we can very much continue to err and just go in the opposite direction of what we were expecting to. And frankly speaking, when we got on the Security Council in 2014, Libya and Yemen were considered to be success stories. They were touted as success stories when we left the Security Council, and it's not up to us to have ruined those two countries. But when we left the Security Council, we know both countries had been in an abyss. And it ended up being a situation where after we left, the penholder UK didn't even work on anything substantial in Yemen because the situation was so difficult and there was no agreement to that. So a silence followed for months and months and months instead of trying to take action and see how to get out of the hellhole that that country was in. So asking questions is very important, and that refers to the meetings, I think, as well. Because if you talk to an SRSG, if you talk to a head of a mission, if you talk to a force commander, and you just read, you go through that prepared statement without looking at that person, without asking, what do you want? What do you need? What kind of specific issues you have? How can we help you? What can we do as a council? Then we're in trouble, I think. And we have been in trouble on so many occasions. That's why these strange examples that I started with were happening, because nobody ever bothered to ask. I can see why delegations would not want to go off script and start talking even in closed consultations, because there are leaks, and leaks happen for all kinds of reasons. Some leaks happen just because you want to impact and change the position of a certain country. Some leaks happen because you want to elicit a certain decision by Security Council. Some leaks happen just for personal reasons, perhaps. But leaks scare the delegations off. They don't want to be, in trouble with their own capitals because somebody will report that this was not said, this particular phrase was omitted. So they just plow through these written statements without looking up and expect that things will happen by themselves. And things don't happen by themselves. And therefore, we can look into the reform as enlargement of seats. In our case, as a country, we think enlargement has to happen in both categories of seats. But if we don't change the culture of the organization, if we don't look back at the UN Charter that has been referred to today several times and the role of Security Council members, we can go mechanically into enlarging a council. But then we'll have more of the same, just taking longer time, lengthier discussions, more money spent on after-hours meetings and all of that, more expensive to maintain, but it will not change the substance. But can we make the Security Council work as that body which speaks for all of us, as we the people, and represents a higher good, a higher interest? That's a major question. And I think, although it's not part of the official Security Council reform agenda, I think these two aspects need to be linked together. Because, again, enlargements and seat arrangements, as important as they are, because no doubt Security Council today doesn't represent a 21st century world. But if that other aspect, the transformational change of the culture of the organization and how the council works, doesn't happen alongside with the reform, we'll end up with nothing. And one last point, in terms of the transformation, how do we elect Security Council members? It's not part of the official reform agenda either, but again, if we elect Security Council members because we had a mutual support arrangement, because there were lavish gifts, bribes at times, parties and all kinds of fancy entertainment, and that influences our votes for a country which may be a major human rights abuser, which may be a breaker of the rule of law, which may not qualify in any particular way to stand up for these higher values and principles inscribed in the UN Charter, then we have no one to blame but ourselves, I think. And I don't know if that makes sense in the context of Security Council reform, I'm afraid not, but that's experience, as I said, it's a very personal, it's a very private experience, because if you leave the Security Council with a sense of accomplishment, and I think I do have that sense of accomplishment, because I think we managed to, as I said, we managed to transform up to a point how subsidiary bodies work. We managed to speak up for some principled issues, human rights related, behavior of the P5 in particular, in certain cases. For us, in Ukraine and Ukraine's violation of Ukraine's sovereignty was a tremendous issue for which we stood very, very openly and very vocally. But at the same time, a huge sense of failure and a huge sense of loss personally, because if you have to sit through 12 Security Council vetoes on Syria, and if you have to realize that when there were 5,000 deaths in Syria, Security Council was vocal. When there were 10,000 deaths in Syria, Security Council was vocal. When there were like 500,000 deaths in Syria, United Nations simply stopped counting the casualties. And you have to face with that, you have to accept that there's nothing you can do, as much as you sit day and night, as much as you deliberate, there's nothing you can do. I think it's tremendous sense and tremendous burden that if we do our job as permanent representatives, as delegations, honestly and sincerely and with the best of intentions, and if we leave the council with a situation worse off than we came in, and we know we've tried but we couldn't help, at least I have a clean conscience, I've tried my best. But the pain, I mean, I've been out of council for 3 years now at least, the sense of frustration, the pain of that failure lingers on, and it will not go anytime soon. Every time I hear about Yemen, every time I hear about Syria, and every time I hear about some other situation we had to deal with, Central African Republic, I shudder, because I think we as a collective body, as a Security Council, with such tremendous powers and such expectations from the population, we have failed. And therefore, the Security Council reform is tremendously important and necessary, but how we go about it, how we muster the political will to change that body, I think is in the hands of us all. We can't, complain that things aren't happening and then be too timid and too afraid to change things.
Thank you very much. And now, Sebastian von Einsiedel.
Terrific, thank you so much. I wanted to make 10 points highlighting what I think are some of the broader insights the Secretary General-led reform process tells us about the state of the UN and the ability of any Secretary General to reform the organization. And I'll deploy the same device that Jan Eliasson did, which is to lure you down a path towards depression, only to surprise you at the end with a couple of notes of optimism. First, observing the reform process and DSG's reform agenda over the past couple of years, I can't help avoid a certain sense of déjà vu. It's worth remembering that Antonio Guterres is the third Secretary General in a row, at least the third Secretary General in a row, who makes prevention a priority, who embarks on major management reform, and who promises to make the UN a more accountable and coherent organization able to deliver as one. Yet the structural hurdles that have frustrated previous reform efforts remain in place, so expectations on what reform can achieve will need to take that into account. Second, a lot of the current reform agenda on the restructuring of the peace and security architecture, the management reform, and the UN development system reform is geared towards institutional tinkering, towards rearranging of the deck chairs. And I didn't use the word Titanic here. There is no doubt that gains can be achieved in terms of effectiveness and efficiency of the organization in doing so, but that does come at pretty significant transaction costs. And at least in the past, institutional fixes have often disappointed. I myself was quite involved in the Kofi Annan-led reform effort in 2004-2005, where Ambassador Loy played such a prominent role at the time. And I think with the benefit of hindsight, it's fair to say that the institutional creations coming out of that resembled little Frankensteins at times. And anyway, Kofi Annan and other SGs tend to be not remembered for the changes they make into the Secretariat's organigram, but more for their response to real-world crisis and for their overall norm entrepreneurship. Third point, while the current reform efforts do reaffirm the rule that SGs tend to have early on in their term a unique window of opportunity to embark on structural reform, the past couple of years also told us that it's become much harder over time. And the main reason it's become harder over time is that the micromanagement by member states of what the SG is doing inside Secretariat has increased dramatically. In '92, it took Boutros Ghali exactly 2 months to see through a sweeping reform of the UN Secretariat towards a structure that largely resembles the one we still have today. And even in 2007, Ban Ki-moon was able to create the Department of Field Support within 6 months. By contrast, it took Guterres now 2 years to see through his institutional reform agenda. Fourth point, and related, is that micromanagement of member states is greatest in the area where reform arguably matters most, which is budgetary matters. The UN's administrative regulations were designed for an organization of career civil servants organizing conferences in New York, and not for an organization where 50% of its staff is deployed in the field in peace operations. And the UN is the only organization where the governing body manages the personnel budget at the level of individual posts rather than overall budget envelopes. So as a result, an SRSG can mediate a peace treaty, but cannot decide whether a sub-regional civil affairs officer should be at a P2 or P3 level, and that's crazy. And this is why on management reform, the Secretary General, when he presented his reform agenda to member states, wisely and ambitiously proposed 2 contracts. One contract between himself and senior managers, where he gives senior managers greater delegation of authority in return for greater accountability, and a second contract between himself and member states, and that's the ambitious contract, where member states give him greater authority to shift around financial resources in a way he sees fit in return for greater transparency. Now, the first contract, he got an okay from member states, but the second contract, unsurprisingly but sadly, turned out to be a no-go zone, and that will, of course, continue to hobble the UN in years ahead. Fifth point, we've seen in the past, and we've seen now again, that internal bureaucratic resistance to change remains a big hurdle. On the reform process of the so-called peace and security architecture within the Secretariat, the major reform was to merge the regional divisions of the peacekeeping department and the political affairs department into one, to drive regional plans and strategies and responses to crises. In principle, a good idea. But what happened is that this merger took place, to take formulations from the immigration debate, in a kind of salad bowl function model rather than a melting pot model. So they were kind of layered like a salade niçoise, with existing units kept intact instead of kind of really merging them, creating synergy and freeing up new staff to dedicate to new priority areas. And the reason this was so is because in the internal discussions on how to implement this merging of the two of the regional divisions, the managers of the different departments and divisions were just very, very keen to maintain existing structures and defend turf. It's overall still a positive reform, but a highly minimalist one as a result. 6, and that won't surprise anybody here, resource constraints, of course, continue to frustrate meaningful reform. In the area of development system reform, the big reform effort here, the big ticket item, is a splitting of the resident coordinator function. That's basically the main UN envoy of a UN country team meant to coordinate the entire country team, and the function of the head of UNDP. These used to be, until recently, one person that's dual-headed, and now they're being split. And it's a very good idea. It's an idea that folks who had thought a long time how to give the resident coordinators a greater prevention role and how to empower them and how to lead to advance more coherent country team responses in the field had advocated for a long time. Problem is that the General Assembly endorsed the structural reform but denied the Secretary General actually the resources for that on an assessed budget. So now the Secretary General has to run around every year and raise $250 million for that reform. And, you know, I don't know how this thing is seen in Denmark, but in Germany, one of big donor countries, I'm not sure they will be willing for many years to help coughing up, you know, something that adds up to $250 million a year for donor coordination. And so it's well possible that this, on paper, good reform will end up in a way that weakens the resident coordinator system. 7th point is, and this has been alluded before, it's very difficult to make progress on a prevention agenda at a time when sovereigntism at the UN is on the rise, with China and Russia in particular drawing the boundaries of the UN's remit quite narrowly. And this has seriously constrained the reform process. Now, Sam has mentioned that the SG's reform and prevention agenda, along with the sustaining peace agenda and the Agenda 2030 on the SDGs, is all about integration of the development pillar with the peace and security pillar and the human rights pillar. So in theory, that's a good thing. But on the, in reality, realizing that in an operational way at the UN is extremely hard, as a result of which the UN development reform process and the peace and security reform process happened on completely different tracks, because the main constituency among member states of the development system, the G77 and NAM countries, were just extremely protective to ensure that there would be no securitization or politicization of the UN's development process in countries. So there is absolutely, literally zero overlap between these two reform tracks. UN development system reform and RC reform, you will look for the word prevention in vain, and on peace and security reform, there is nothing that would bring the peace and security side of the house closer to UNDP and other development agencies. 8th point, I think the reform process illustrates very well that the permanent 5 members of the Security Council are continuing not only to tighten their grip on the Security Council, but also on the Secretariat, in particular Secretariat posts. That places serious limits on meaningful reform, because in an age where the permanent 5 consider it their birthright to own certain departments in the Secretariat, rearrangement of these is quite difficult, and I really think it badly eats away at the legitimacy of the UN, and I think this has gotten worse with the reform and the creation of an Office of Counterterrorism headed by USG, who is now owned, which is now a Russian, and I'm sure the office is seen as owned by the Russians. I think the Secretary General here need support from member states to fight back against the P5. Ninth point, I think the reform process tells us quite a bit about China's ambitions at the UN. I mean, I think most people have heard that China's assertiveness in the Security Council has grown quite a bit. I think maybe a few less people have heard that China's activism in being involved in secretariat structure and budgets and individual posts in the Fifth Committee has grown dramatically. And with China just a few weeks ago having become the second largest funder of the UN, I think their contribution increased from 8 to 12% or something like that. Of course, their leverage grows. I could offer some detail on how this plays out in the reform process, but I won't bore you with the detail. So my 10th point is where I'm coming at you with a couple of points of optimism, which is that notwithstanding the cautionary tone so far, I think there is a positive reform story to tell if one looks beyond mere institutional reform. Sam has mentioned that the focus on institutional reform obscures the larger cultural shift that the Secretary General is aiming at in terms of driving into innovation, pushing for more accountability, greater transparency, early action, regional thinking, making the UN more a platform for others to act rather than necessarily being an actor in its own right, and all these things. Second, I think management reform is actually real as far as the delegation of authority to senior managers is concerned. It's in the process. We haven't seen it yet, but it is real. And I think there are a number of discrete reform processes underway that really have the potential to make a real difference or are already making a real difference. I think the push towards gender parity is first and foremost among them. If you look at senior appointments at the UN, we are close to parity, and that's a big change from what we've seen under Ban Ki-moon. I think processes such as action for peacekeeping that Ambassador Loy has mentioned, we don't see that yet being implemented in the Security Council, but we see it implemented in the Secretariat, and I think, General, you were referring to it. There is a very serious push towards enhancing performance and being tough on troop-contributing countries that send troops that are completely under-equipped, under-trained, to actually send them back. So that sends an important message. There is a serious effort underway to bridge the development humanitarian gap through something that's called the New Way of Working, coming out of the Humanitarian Summit of 2016. That's real. And then, of course, there is the daily ongoing process of incremental reform that we're seeing at the UN that comes from incremental learning through practice in the field, such as sanctions implementation, mediation, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, and all these things, where the UN has become a seriously more professional organization than it was 15, 20 years ago. So irrespective of any reform, SG reform agenda, the UN is actually an organization that finds itself in permanent reform and often towards the better. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to all three speakers. I think, Sebastian, you had 8 negative and 2 positive.
9.
Nine?
Call them negative. They were just
okay.
cautionary.
But I think it was more or less like the 2 other speakers. So about 10% positive, and the rest was more or less negative, or at least neutral. We didn't hear that much about reform program